Socrates could have been a wealthy man. He was brilliant, famous across Athens, and men lined up to hear him speak, yet he refused to take a single coin for teaching, and he walked the city barefoot by choice. That decision was not eccentricity. It was a precise argument about freedom, and it still contradicts almost everything you have been told about security. Most of us equate having more with being safer. Socrates believed the opposite, that every possession is a leash, and the man with the fewest is the hardest to control. In this video we will examine what Socrates actually said about money, why he chose to own almost nothing, and what that choice reveals about the life you are quietly building. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe. Every video here is built around an idea worth your time. He left no books of his own, everything we know comes through Plato and Xenophon, written in the decades after his death in 399 BC. And in one of those accounts, standing in a market full of things he could not afford, he said something that reframes the whole idea of wealth. Xenophon, who knew Socrates personally, records a small scene in the memorabilia that says more than any lecture could. Socrates walks through the crowded Athenian agora, surrounded by luxury goods laid out for sale, and instead of longing for them he remarks how many things there are that he does not need. This is the whole man in a single sentence, because he was measuring wealth in reverse. To Socrates, riches were not what you accumulate but the distance between your desires and your needs, and the shorter that distance, the wealthier you actually are. He pushed this further than sounds comfortable. In Xenophon's account he claims that to need nothing is divine, and to need as little as possible is the nearest thing to the divine that a human can reach. Notice what he's doing here. He isn't praising poverty as suffering, he's redefining self-sufficiency as a kind of power. The person who requires little cannot be threatened by loss, bribed by gain, or bent by the fear of going without. And this is where the modern nerve gets touched. We build our security outward, savings, property, backups, contingencies, which means our peace of mind is scattered across 100 things we don't control. Socrates built his security inward, and so there was almost nothing left for fortune to take. But this raises a harder question, one his critics threw at him directly: if he was so wise, why was he so poor? The objection was real and it stung. In the Athens of Socrates, poverty was mostly shameful, a sign of failure or bad character, and the men who taught for money, the sophists, were the respected professionals of their day. Socrates deliberately stood outside that system, and he had a reason that goes deeper than thrift. He argued that each thing you own quietly issues a command. A house must be maintained, a fine cloak must be protected, servants must be managed, reputation must be defended, and every one of those obligations is a small subtraction from your freedom to think and act as you choose. Honestly, this is the part of Socrates that convinces me. He wasn't romanticizing hardship. He was doing a cost accounting that almost nobody does, adding up not the price of a thing but the ongoing tax it charges on your attention for as long as you keep it. A possession is never really finished being paid for. Plato gives us the sharpest image of this in the Apology, where Socrates tells the jury that he neglected the things most men chase: money, household, military command, public office, in order to attend to the one thing that mattered, the state of his own soul. That's the trade laid bare. He gave up the visible life to secure the invisible one. And yet most people who quote Socrates on simplicity get his actual position badly wrong, which is worth stopping on. Here is the common misreading, that Socrates hated money, treated wealth as evil, and preached poverty as a virtue in itself. I assumed something like this myself for a long time. I was wrong. Socrates never says money is bad. In Xenophon's Economicus he speaks approvingly of a well-managed estate and admires men who handle property wisely. What he attacks is not the coin but the enslavement to it, the moment when a man no longer owns his wealth but is owned by it. The distinction is everything. Socrates refused payment for teaching not because money is dirty, but because taking a fee would have made him a servant of his students' expectations. In the Apology he's explicit, because he charged nothing, no one could claim he was obligated to tell them what they wanted to hear. His poverty bought him the one thing he refused to sell, an unbought mind. Wealth, to him, was fine, dependence on wealth was the trap. So the man who owned almost nothing was not running from money. He was refusing to let it run him, and he understood that these are opposite postures that happen to produce a similar-looking bank account. One is deprivation. The other is command. What separates them is entirely internal, which means you cannot tell them apart from the outside. But there's a specific conversation Socrates had about ownership that makes this concrete, and it's about something as ordinary as a house. There's a story, preserved in later sources about Socrates, in which a friend shows him plans for a large and impressive house and asks what he thinks. Socrates is said to have replied by asking what such a house was for, and whether so much space would only mean more rooms to fill, more to guard, and more to lose. I'll be honest that the exact wording here is uncertain. Some of these Socratic anecdotes are attributed to him rather than firmly documented, and I'd rather flag that than pretend otherwise. But the reasoning is entirely consistent with what Plato and Xenophon record, so the shape of it is trustworthy even where the words are not. The logic runs like this. A larger house does not shelter you more, it exposes you more, because now your peace depends on its condition. Expand your possessions and you expand your surface area, the number of points at which the world can wound you. Socrates saw ownership as vulnerability wearing the mask of comfort. Picture the modern version. Someone finally buys the home they dreamed of, and within a year their weekends belong to its repairs, their conversations circle its mortgage, and a leak in the roof can ruin a month. The house was supposed to be theirs. Increasingly, they are its. Socrates would not have found this ironic. He would have found it inevitable, the predictable tax on anything you let yourself need. Which brings us to the principle underneath all of it, the one you can actually use. The principle Socrates lived by can be stated plainly, and it is the single claim this whole video defends: nothing you own is free, because everything you own costs you attention, and attention is the only currency your soul actually spends. Money is renewable. The hours and worry a possession draws out of you are not. This is why he could stand in a market full of things he couldn't buy and feel richer than the men buying them. He had already subtracted the hidden price they were about to pay. And yet Socrates was not asking you to give everything away. That's the final misreading to bury. He's asking a prior question, one that comes before any purchase: does this thing serve my freedom, or does it quietly begin to govern me? A cloak that keeps you warm serves you. A cloak you're afraid to dirty has started to give orders. The object hasn't changed. Your relationship to it has. What this reveals, in the end, is that Socrates measured a life not by what it had gathered but by what it could lose without flinching. In Plato's Phaedo, facing execution, he shows almost no anxiety, and it's hard not to connect that steadiness to a lifetime of owning nothing that death could threaten. He had spent his years making himself unconfiscatable. So the practice he leaves us is not about spending less. It's about needing less, on purpose, and discovering how much freedom was hiding underneath everything you thought you couldn't live without. So Socrates owned almost nothing, not because wealth was evil, but because he had done the honest math on ownership and found that every possession charges a tax in attention and worry, and he refused to pay it for anything that didn't earn its keep by serving his freedom. Here is the practice, in 3 steps. First, tonight, look at one thing you own and ask what it costs you beyond its price, in upkeep, in worry, in fear of losing it. Second, for 1 week, notice each time a desire is actually a need in disguise, and each time it isn't. Third, remove or refuse one thing you don't truly require, and feel what it gives back. The richest man in Athens was the one with the least to lose. Philosophy is not an academic exercise. It is the art of living well. Subscribe if you want to keep at it. And if you want something concrete to take with you, There is a free Stoic starter kit in the description, 20 timeless quotes, a 7-day routine, and a printable journal. Any books mentioned today are also linked below.